you all for taking the time here to learn about the Financial Policy Challenge with us, the 2020 Financial Policy Challenge. I'm with Scott Huzingay from the city of Kansas City, Missouri. And, really the first thing is, and Dan, I could get the ball for the presentation. I'll move the slides here. Is the kind of first part is the challenge as we kind of described it when we first came up with the Financial Policy Challenge a month ago. Well, the definition has changed a little bit. We now have a dual meaning. There's a new type of challenge in front of us. Originally, the Financial Policy Challenge was posed in the context of GFOA's Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities program, but it's also extremely relevant to the times we find ourselves in, the fiscal first aid era. So you may have seen this before. This is our GFOA's 12 steps through the process of financial recovery. We had a couple webinars about some of these topics already. We had the little yellow circle there under generic treatments is a white paper we produced called Cash is King, which is available on the Fiscal First Aid website, which is gfoa.org/FFA, as in Fiscal First Aid. There are also recordings of prior webinars we've done on the subject matter. But today we're going to be focusing on step 10, the red circle, about recovery and leadership, because financial policies are a really important part of leading your organization through the recovery process. So let's start out with learning a little bit more about why that is. So the original 12-step program that we came up with was developed through a lot of research and looking at analogous situations in other industries that had experienced financial distress, including, of course, in addition to, I should say, the experiences of local governments. So these lessons from analogous situations can be quite useful, and one that is useful to our discussion here today comes from the military. So you see on the slide here that militaries often have characteristics of uncertain decision-making environments, so they're resource constrained, right? If you're on a battlefield, you don't necessarily have every resource you could ever want. It's dynamic, things explode, right? It's highly uncertain, you don't know what the enemy is going to do. But those three characteristics, resource constrained, dynamic, highly uncertain, does that sound familiar, right, in today's environment with what local governments are going through? So a very useful tool then that comes from the world of the military that is important to our conversation is called commander's intent. And the idea behind commander's intent is essentially that in the military, maybe contrary to popular belief or the stereotype, the commanders are not specifying every single operational detail for the troops. Rather, commander's intent is really a description of what a successful mission looks like. And military planning then begins with this mission statement that describes how the mission will be executed. And it's really kind of trying to describe to people what the battlefield looks like at the conclusion of the mission, or what success looks like. And the idea behind commander's intent is that you're fully recognizing and appreciating the chaos, lack of complete information picture, changes in the enemy situation, and other relevant factors that make a plan either completely or partially obsolete once it is executed. So the purpose of commander's intent in this environment is to empower subordinates to guide their initiative and improvise, they adapt the plan to a changing environment. So as we see on the slide here, it provides this spectrum of improvisation. And the idea being is that this isn't giving the subordinates just permission to do whatever they would like. It has certain boundaries on the mission and has proven processes or keeps the proven processes in place. So just to give you a little example of how commander's intent has worked in real life, we can go back to World War II and D-Day. And so originally during that invasion, there were, of course, plans as to where all the troops would land, either by sea or by air. But because of just the chaos of war, that did not happen, and people landed in very different places from what the plan originally called for. So kind of just looking at it from at the landing from that basis, it kind of looked like a disaster was unfolding. But yet hours later, the original military objectives were being accomplished by the units that had formed, because they knew, like, okay, our mission is to just take the bridge. We don't have like a detailed guidance on, well, we have to take this road at this time. It's just take the bridge. You've landed, take the bridge. That's the commander's intent. It is now up to you to improvise within that framework, and people successfully did it. So you could imagine in financial policies, like maybe an easy way to think about this is reserves might be a pretty obvious one, where you've got maybe a range of acceptable reserves that you're trying to maintain, and there's maybe some flexibility then to use reserves within that spectrum. So we'll get into some of that as we go through the presentation, but kind of the takeaway from this slide is thinking about policies as a form of a commander's intent is positions them as a tool to manage uncertainty in your environment. We'll say a bit about that here on our next slide, which is a few of the reasons why policies are commander's intent is, number one, they define the big picture financial objectives. So what are the bottom line indicators or policies that we are trying to keep in line with? Provides the boundaries for acceptable action, as I just mentioned with the fund balance. Another great example that we'll get into in this presentation is local debt limits. So maybe, for instance, in your current situation, maybe pay-go capital financing or pay-as-you-go or cash capital financing, as it is otherwise known, is not as practical as it once was. So maybe debt needs to take on a greater role. In that case, having local debt limits help provide that boundary for acceptable action. And lastly, it serves as the basis for evaluating actions. And so the idea being, if you don't evaluate your actions to see what went right and what went wrong, it's a bit hard to learn and improve. So because financial policies have these standards in place, they provide the basis for evaluation. So with that, we are going to move on to some of the next segment of the presentation, which is about the various types of policies that are going to be most salient in the current situation we find ourselves in. And as we do that, Scott, if there's anything you'd like to comment on with respect to commander's intent, feel free to do so. But Scott, is there anything you want to say on this point?
Nope. Sounds good. Keep going right now, Shane.
All right, very good, great. So these are the financial policies with special relevance to our challenge today. So we're going to go through these five: is fund balance / reserves, one-time revenue, debt burden, fees, and long-term financial planning. And the Financial Policy Challenger website has policy templates for these. So if you don't have this and you'd like to develop these policies, you can get the templates there. There are also downloadable examples. So you can download examples from communities that have submitted their policies to the challenge already. And also there's I will mention a website for this particular training class, this webinar, on the Fiscal First Aid website. So if you want to download slides or any of the resources we refer to throughout this presentation, you can do that at the Financial Policy Challenge website. So let's move on to our first poll question. So the poll question is, which single policy listed below is most important for your government to adopt or renew in the coming months? So in other words, this being the Financial Policy Challenge, some of those policies might be more important than others for you to adopt. And so which one do you think is the most important to either adopt, or if you say, you know what, we may already have it, but we need to take a second look at it and make sure it's tightened up, you can feel free to answer on that basis either, or as well. We'll give you guys a minute to answer there. All right, Dan, and why don't we maybe go ahead and close that poll if we've gotten a sufficient number of responses. All right, I see fund balance reserve, so that is an important one for folks, understandably. And fortunately, it is the first one on our list. So, on this slide, we have the essential components of a reserve policy. So why reserve is important. So it's always important in any policy to explain up front why it's important. If you've not heard of this, there's a really good book called Start With Why by Simon Sinek that just explains the psychological power of starting any idea with why. His basic point is that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So just explaining what the policy is not going to be as compelling to people if they understand the reasons for why it exists. And the reason it exists in a case of fund balances reserves is of course a risk management tool. And I think people will get that in this environment. We also have on the slide here the idea of minimum reserve is highlighted because that is of course going to be of special interest to people nowadays. And the kind of maybe just a few months ago, the question people might ask about their reserves is, well, how much is enough? How much should we have? Well, right now, the literal million-dollar question is how much can you use right now safely? And the other question might be is for how long and for what, which gets to our third bullet point. Because really reserves are essentially a form of bridge financing. So if the policy can provide guidance on this in terms of how long you will use the reserves, and also having kind of help frame a discussion of what the reserves are going to be used for. So if you're using them as a bridge to the future, that is definitely different than just simply replacing lost ongoing revenues. The policy kind of again helps establish that intent so that people know the parameters they have available for action. And then lastly on the slide, we have the bullet about replenishing reserves after they are used. And certainly it's a bit premature to actually replenish the reserve, but I think it is valuable in a policy to, again, establish the intent that this is the plan so that as the organization moves through recovery, people understand that the idea is that, well, we did use them in the bad time, and so we then have to build them back up when things are looking better so that we'll be prepared for the next potential risk. And Scott is going to share with us a little bit about some of his experience in Kansas City on this issue.
So on this slide, Kansas City has a reserve policy that closely resembles some of the models that GFOA has provided in the past. We have an adopted goal of 2 months, or about 17% of operating reserves in our general fund. And of that 2 month goal, we have it divided essentially into two pieces, 1 month each for what's called a counter-cyclical reserve and an emergency reserve. Our 10-year chart here shows that just in the last couple of years, the city has actually achieved its reserve goals, and really for the first time ever. What the chart does not show is that in the years prior to 2010, at the time of the previous recession, our reserves were practically zero before beginning to climb. It's increased dramatically beginning in 2015 when the city adopted a formal long-term financial plan policy, and we'll talk about that shortly. But the key takeaway for us, especially now, is that the emphasis of specifically our reserve policy and some of our others as well, and adhering to it has been especially critical now as we begin to navigate the uncertainty of the COVID-19 crisis before us. And having these reserves in place allows us to navigate the situation probably in a much different way than we probably would have just even a few years ago. And we'll touch upon some of our other policies here in just a second.
All right, well, great. Thank you, Scott, for that. So moving on to the next slide here. This is a little resource for you. So part of the question is how much can we use right now? And answering that question, I think in many ways, is helped by an understanding of the risks that your reserves are intended to mitigate, right? Because just because we have an COVID and a financial crisis does not mean that floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, and whatever else are put on hold, right? Those could all still happen. So having a sense of the full portfolio, if you will, of risks that your government is subject to and what role reserves have in responding to those risks can be very informative and, I would say, confidence building for your governing board to feel like, okay, well, we know what we need to have aside to deal with other risks besides financial crisis caused by the current situation. And therefore, if we know what we need for these other risks, that does mean this remaining amount is available for helping us in the current situation. So what we've got here is a little report that we developed for Colorado Springs that describes a method for doing that. This report is available on that website I mentioned at www.gfa.org/FFA. So you can download that report, and I know a number of governments have copied the method that is outlined in this report. So we're hopeful that you will be able to do that too if that would be of interest. Okay, let's move on to the next section here. We've got a little poll question. Which of the following best describes your current reserve target? And this is kind of following on our discussion of the risk we just had. Is your reserve target based on an explicit risk analysis, maybe something like Colorado Springs, where we're cataloging out, here are the risks we're subject to, this is how much money we need to deal with them? Or is it more B, implicitly considering risk, where people understand the reserves as a risk management tool, you just haven't gone so far as to mathematically model it? Or is it kind of our last option there, not risk-based? So we'll give folks a minute to respond to that. And Dan, why don't you go ahead and close it when you feel we've got a bulk of our folks having a chance to respond. Right. Curious to see the answer to that. And but let's move to our next policy here, which is one-time revenue. So the basic idea, the classic idea, if you will, behind a one-time revenue policy is that a one-time revenue, like say from selling an asset, shouldn't be used to fund ongoing expenditures. So if you, let's say, sell a piece of property, you should not use that property to the proceeds from that property to hire new police officers, for instance, right? But this is a new environment where maybe people aren't really worried about hiring new police officers. They're worried about maintaining the ones that are already there. So, this might cause need to revisit how the one-time revenue policy is operationalized, right? So maybe if it's like, well, if we have one-time revenue, we can use that in the same way we're using reserves, which is to help us make a softer landing, but we have to also make sure at the same time that we're not using these reserves for some purposes unsustainable, and that we are also using this just to buy time to get to a more sustainable cost structure. Because of the kind of the strategy is, well, we use the one-time revenues and then hope things turn around. Like, hope is not a strategy, as the saying goes. So if one-time revenues are positioned as a way to make this transition to the new kind of more cost stable future, I think that's a good thing, and the policies can help guide that. And just a quick little resource for you on the Financial Policy Challenger website. You can download policies from other governments that have submitted. And I think the City of Denver's policy on one-time revenues is particularly good. There's a lot of good policies up there, but if I'm picking one to suggest you download in this area, it's the City of Denver's. I think they have some kind of unique features that it's not going to fit everybody, but because they have these unique features, I think it makes it very interesting to look at and potentially useful, especially around undependable revenues, because they're very sales tax dependent in Denver. So definitely a good one when it comes to providing food for thought on how to maybe construct your own one-time revenue policy. And with that, we're going to move on here to Scott, who's going to tell us a little bit about the policy in Kansas City.
Sure. Just very quickly to follow up, this is a portion of Kansas City's revenue policy as it relates to one-time revenues. This has been, for us, another critical component of building Kansas City's reserve position to weather the storm. I think following Shane's commander's intent model, we've tried to consistently remind our council and the public of our financial policies and our long-term financial planning, and with specific respect to one-time uses. We have a policy in place that we think has at least helped to resist at least some of the urges to spend down any limited cash infusions that have occurred during the financial upswing. Again, just to reiterate, in preparation for what we're experiencing now. So this has been one additional piece that we adopted, I think, in 2012 that is beginning to pay dividends now.
All right. right. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a great point, Scott, that Scott's making is, a lot of times putting these policies in place during a downturn like we have now is actually perhaps more possible in some ways, right? Because people are more open to new ideas and doing things differently, and then they pay big dividends later on, as well as being beneficial in the near term. All right, moving on to debt burden. So why a policy is important, again, starting with why, is you have to have some kind of local debt limit, because the limits prescribed by states and provincial governments are usually one size fits all type of limits, and because they are one size fits all, they're so high that they're just unrealistic. For example, when I was an assistant city manager and was a GFOA member, we had a local debt limit from the state, and if we ever got anywhere near that limit, we would have been bankrupt like 10 times over. So we had our own limit that was more applicable and relevant to our situation. And again, the idea being here is that pay-as-you-go may no longer be the same option it once was. And even going beyond that, if history is any guide, during recessions, interest rates drop, and governments are going to have a really big opportunity for counter-cyclical investing. In fact, there was a very interesting study I saw a few years back about P3s and why those P3s are cost beneficial in the public sector context. And a big reason for the cost beneficial nature of these P3s is that the private companies that run them are willing to invest counter-cyclically. So they're willing to make the capital investments when the interest rates are low, whereas governments tend to avoid issuing debt when interest rates are low, meaning during recessions, and then will be more likely or feel better about issuing debt when the economy is good and interest rates are a little higher. So having a strong debt policy that describes the appropriate conditions for debt and also has local debt limits can be super powerful, and giving people comfort that debt can be used responsibly, and also be very good for helping the local government and the community build the capital assets that are necessary to have a thriving and livable environment for everybody. And I'm just going to skip ahead a slide just to show you something right now that I think is relevant. Is this? We have a good resource on this idea of local debt limits. Comes from Wake County, North Carolina. They have an excellent program for integrating local debt limits, I should say, into their capital planning process. So there's a little paper that you can download at the site I've been telling you about that describes exactly how Wake County does it, shows the dashboard of local indicators they have created for their own local debt limits. So I strongly encourage you to check out what Wake County is doing. I think they've done an excellent job pulling that all together. Okay, and with that, we're going to go on to Scott. And Scott, I think you're going to share some of your ideas for other policies that are kind of related to the sorts of things we're talking about and that have been of special use and benefit for Kansas City.
Sure. Quickly, well, I'll go through some of our other policies I think in the overall framework have led to where we are now. Another portion of our revenue policy I talked about earlier relates specifically to maintaining a broad mix of revenue sources. For example, in the current situation, we expect our conventions and tourism taxes to be hit especially hard because obviously restaurants and hotels are closed effectively or operating on a very limited basis, and followed by our sales tax, at least in the short run, to be hit quite dramatically, at least in the near term. But the city also has a stable property tax source that is another piece of the pie, and Kansas City is somewhat unique compared to most local jurisdictions in that it has an earnings tax that will also be a stabilizing force in the long run after, again, some expected short-term declines as it relates to COVID-19. So again, the idea behind the revenue diversification is to maintain several different types of sources, and as a council considers future tax policy not to bolster up one particular area too much, so that again, just like that one's personal portfolio, the more diversification you have, the more opportunities you have to weather some of the storms that come our way. And guys, I'm not sure if I have the ball or not, but on the next slide is... I've got it. I'll do the slides for you, Scott. No worry. Okay, not a problem. The next policy relates to the city's structurally balanced budget. It's a separate but related piece to our revenue policy. again, emphasizing that distinction between recurring and non-recurring revenues, as well as appropriate uses of surplus reserves as well. And on the next slide of the same policy, item 8 specifically directs the staff to develop a financial guide for emergencies and unexpected events. And I'd say this time we're in now certainly qualifies as both an emergency and an unexpected event. So having this one in place for several years, again, is just yet another way for us to prepare for what has now come to pass, even though we didn't foresee exactly the situation we're in now, but we've been prepared for some type of emergency situation should it take place.
Yeah, Scott, maybe I might add a comment. We're going to get to this in a little bit with the long-term financial planning, but I'm wondering if you were saying this, it occurred to me that having these policies in place, perhaps does it create the intent or the idea with the elected officials that the standard is a structurally balanced budget? So as you guys are thinking about your cutback strategies and how to balance a budget in the situation, has this kind of proven influential in their thinking in terms of hey, we've got to come up with strategies that are not going to make us worse in the long run for the sake of having some short-term relief?
That's precisely right, and I'll talk about more when we get to long-term financial planning. But the intent of all of these policies that we've adopted over the course of time, and we've done them incrementally since starting probably in about 2009, at least when we start updating them, is not that council is certainly going to remember the details of every single policy, but just the constant awareness that at the council level that we do have these policies and we do adhere to them, and we're there as a grounding and reminding force to them, and how they now reference our citywide business plan. All that put together has made the council much more vigilant in its fiscal decisions than it probably was prior to having our adopted policies. So it really is that awareness factor more than anything else that drives the importance of these policies.
Oh, great. All right. And I think we had a next slide here, Scott, with the budget reporting.
So we have formalized our budget reporting and budget monitoring policy through quarterly reports. This has provided timely updates to the City Council. Again, especially during times like this, I just had to report on our year-end situation yesterday to our City Council and how that has changed precipitously just in the last few weeks. Our office, the Office of Management and Budget, has conducted quarterly analyses off and on for really the better part of 2 decades. But the addition of the formal policy, which I think this one happened to have been adopted in around 2014 or 15, again, it's a reminder to the council of the importance of budget monitoring and reporting, and why we do it on a routine basis, not just as a matter of form, because it's the way we've always done it, if you will, but because it leads to, again, just greater awareness, hopefully better decision-making, policy-making by the council through constant reports and reminders of where we are fiscally.
Yeah, that's great. And then they had a few more details on this slide, which remind me of a little question for you, Scott. If these are quarterly right now, I'm just curious, do you foresee the need to make these more frequent if the kind of situation gets dicier in terms of like monthly or whatnot, or do you feel quarterly is going to be sufficient?
We provide monthly financial reports through the accounts division in finance, and we've been doing that in a written form for a long time. And it's at the quarterly process where we combine that with our annual projections into a formal quarterly report. To your question, Shane, I think yes, I definitely think that the more formal in-person council presentations likely will become more frequent in the unfortunate event that this situation continues for a longer period of time. Obviously, at this point, we're still optimistic that this is a short-term endeavor, but I'm fielding questions informally almost daily. Like I said, we gave a brief update to the City Council yesterday, and I suspect at least for the next couple months until things hopefully stabilize, this will be of greater importance, especially the items about our reserves, and not just our general fund, but our special revenue funds as well. They're often supported by different types of taxes, how those are faring compared to perhaps where we thought they would fare just a month ago.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe one other question on this point, which I think is the budget reporting point, that is, which I think is maybe particularly relevant to the times we find ourselves in. Now, I see normally you've got under kind of normal circumstances, section C says the finance department will explain any anomalies in the report. And to what extent do you see the departments getting involved, meaning like in terms of making sure they're kind of staying within the planned expenditures and that sort of thing, or how are they involved now? And do you see that being different in the future, like more kind of, we'll say, for lack of a better word, stringent?
Right. Formally, it's a separate piece. It's not part of our budget reporting policy, but actually in our city charter that requires department directors to report directly to council if they anticipate to exceed their budget and to explain the reasons why. Candidly, that's been enforced to varying degrees over the several decades it's been in place. But to your point, though, yes, department directors are required to manage their budget, explain any anomalies, certainly as part of our quarterly reports, sometimes to council as well. And a lot of our departments have already been making committee reports to the city council right now as part of this process, particularly our health department and our public safety departments, which of course are on the front lines of this epidemic right now.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, thank you for that, Scott. I appreciate it. Because I would imagine that, just generally speaking, the idea that if you're needing to report anomalies to a city council, you're probably more likely as a manager and outside the budget department to pay a little closer attention to your spending if you think you might need to go before the council to talk about it.
Yeah, it's safe to say that I can speak personally that I've been getting many more questions internally about our fiscal position and various fund positions than I was, again, just a few weeks ago. So the attention certainly has been raised.
Yeah. All right. Well, great. Thank you. All right. Let's move on to our next policy, which is fees. And I think it's an interesting one because, nowadays a lot of governments are, maybe foregoing fee increases or adopting more lenient collection practices, which is all understandable in the current conditions. But it maybe goes back to something Scott was saying earlier, like, well, establishing these policies now sets up the intent for having a stronger position in the future. So a good example is the blue dot there, blue bullet there, which says desired cost recovery levels. So the idea being is that there are some services, like say building permits or what have you, that really don't benefit people, the public generally, besides the person who is directly consuming the service. And those services would probably there'd be a justification for charging the full cost, where there are other sorts of services, like let's say police or other sort of first responders that don't really have a lot of fees and need to be financed by general tax dollars. And given probably that an increase in general taxes is going to be off the table for most local governments, having your cost recovery levels set appropriately for the services where the service is benefiting a particular individual can be an important part of the total package to have a strong financial foundation as we go through this recovery. So again, establishing the intent up front, even if the we'll say appetite to increase fees immediately is not there. So with that, let's have a little poll question. I've got these options for you. So curious to learn what of the kind of where you guys in the audience are at with your approach to fees now. So a few options there for you. So the first one is kind of the biggest change, where maybe you've frozen fee levels and you've had more lenient collection practices. Second one is you froze the fee levels, but you've got pretty much the same collection practices. Third is more lenient collection practices, but you're still following your fee schedules and with increased costs as planned. And the fourth bullet is essentially no change from where we were a few months ago. And then lastly is none of the above. So if the options we've got there don't cover what you're doing, you can let us know that. So again, Dan, I will leave it to your judgment to close the poll when we've had a sufficient number of responses. All right, so the answers are being calculated right now, and we'll like what those are when it happens. And so in the meantime, let's move on to long-term financial planning. So this is the last of the policies in our agenda. And really, this is another one where one might think, well, we're in a short-term situation right now, and are we really overly concerned about the long term? And it goes back to, I think, something Scott was saying, is that you want to make sure you don't dig yourself a deeper hole when trying to recover from financial distress. Some maybe obvious examples or classic examples would be things like pension holidays, deferring capital maintenance, maybe a suboptimally designed early retirement incentive, are all things that might have some short-term benefits, but we create long-term problems. And I suppose we could probably have a webinar completely devoted to reviewing financial strategies that have near-term benefits and create long-term problems. And a long-term financial planning policy is designed to help you avoid that difficulty. And that's why we've got at the bottom, the little blue highlight area, is a commitment to achieving a balanced long-term financial plan. So not just so much a plan that says, well, expenditures are going way above revenues and that's that, but that has as part of it the strategies that are going to be necessary to keep the plan in balance over a long-term time horizon. So with that, I think Scott has a number of things he'd like to share with you about the excellent work that Kansas City is doing when it comes to long-term financial planning.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, thanks, Shane. Just to continue on that theme of delivering a balanced plan, our last piece, the long-term financial model, is really the culmination of years of evolution on the financial policies I discussed earlier that Kansas City has developed over the last several years. And each year now, as part of Kansas City's citywide business plan process, the city provides a 5-year financial model to the council that includes what we call baseline and balanced scenarios. And like many models, the baseline shows typically declines in fiscal health absent some remedial actions. The 5-year model also presents a balanced scenario that maintains fiscal health with a given set of assumptions. So at least annually, on the next slide, we provide to the council, I mentioned a baseline scenario, what we call the known knowns, so growth assumptions and other programmatic changes that we know with reasonable certainty will occur. And we also provide a balanced scenario that proposes certain fixes or policy changes over the 5-year time horizon. And we do this annually. On the next slide, the city council and ultimately the voters of Kansas City, after a couple of years of us doing this, approved the inclusion of a 5-year financial plan into our city charter. So this became what part of our financial policies through our city charter. Therefore, the city council is required to pass an updated plan each year. They have to do it by November 1st of each year, which is pretty close to the beginning of our annual budget process, so that, again, as the council is required to pass a 5-year plan, which frames the annual budget process that begins and continues immediately after the plan's adoption. So we have to update it every year as part of our annual process. On the next slide, we emphasize also that our model is not necessarily static. In our model, we're very precise in presenting them as scenarios, not as projections or predictions. As we know, and as we have seen recently, obviously, conditions on the ground can change rapidly. As such, our model is intended to be flexible and updated regularly and on demand. In the wake of the COVID-19 outbreak, we were directed to provide some direction and guidance on what economic impacts to expect from the pandemic. We used our existing model that you saw above, and we immediately updated it on demand just within the last couple of weeks with a broad set of new revenue assumptions for the new situation. And we provide, and the bulk of those new assumptions are on the slide before you, but this allowed the council to see where we were before and what new assumptions we were incorporating to the same model pretty much on the fly, given the conditions that we know of or could reasonably assume pretty much as we were making the report. So the next slide, it gives basically our updated charts, and we model more than just the fund balance, but that's our reserves ratios. That's usually the one that receives the most attention. And this part was part of a multi-page report that we delivered to the mayor and the city council just, I think it was a week ago, Monday or Tuesday. We provided updated baselines and a new set of assumptions to respond specifically to this crisis. And this was just before Kansas City's actual shelter-in-place order was implemented, which is a couple weeks old now. So we were doing this very much on the fly. We have, even today, more information than we had just a couple of weeks ago. So this is constantly changing, and we'll probably change several more times before we're done. But as it currently stands, our model represents what has been essentially referred to as a V-shaped recession with a sharp decline, which we're now experiencing, followed by a sharp recovery. So the model in its most recent form also anticipates, even after the hopeful immediate recovery here in the coming weeks, a modest recession of 18 to 24 months immediately after the recovery. So we're thinking right now we'll have a sharp decline, sharp recovery, but with perhaps some residual impacts of recession that lasts about 2 years. So the model essentially presents a scenario that recommends expenditure adjustments based on these new revenue assumptions, and it proposes to recover at least half of our reserve goal within the 5-year period rather than the full 2-month reserve goal, because by trying to recover that much that quickly based on what we've modeled so far, it would be absolutely devastating to our operations. So one thing we've learned through this process is that we have to show flexibility in our goals as well as our assumptions to changing events. So again, having all of the financial policies in place leading up to this crisis, we've been able to emphasize to the council over and over again that we've worked for 10 years to build up reserves for exactly this type of situation, and with that combined with the policies, now the long-term financial planning in place, we think we can weather this storm, and this is exactly why we plan for such an event. So overall, the next page I think provides just a summary of why we do our financial planning, why we do our model. The model and our combined policies have been, like I said, instrumental to building the financial stability that our city has achieved in recent years. We can emphasize again, we have solid reserves, we have a long-term financial plan that we believe will help us weather this storm, and we have reporting policies and guidelines to respond to continually changing conditions as well. So I think this collective framework has about some measure of restraint and levity with our elected officials during a period where it's very tempting to react without a perfectly clear direction. We think, from our standpoint, to use Shane's analogy back at the top of this presentation, the commander's intent is clear with respect to our sustaining our financial goals and financial foundation, and the changing ground conditions remain guided by our overall policy framework. So it's actually, in developing this process over the course of time, this is something that, frankly, we did not expect something on this scale, but again, having these models and these practices in place has really helped us prepare, and it's the foresight of a lot of people over a decade ago that's led us to where we are now. So you see the summary before you, but I thank everyone very much for their time today.
Well, yeah, thank you, Scott, for all your insights. And I was struck by a couple of things that you said I thought might be worth highlighting. I think the fact that you've got the replenishment of the reserve shown in your new balance scenario is great. And, love the fact that you're talking about the intent is there to replenish them, but, we're not going to be so inflexible that we have to get right back to our original goal of the 16 or so percent, right? You have to take a measured approach that's going to be kind of realistic and respectful of the on-the-ground realities that you don't want. I think, as you said, if I remember the word, cripple your operations in the pursuit of these goals, because, of course, then people aren't going to do it, and the whole policy will probably lose a lot of credibility, right? So you've got to kind of adapt it to the situations while preserving that overall intent. And then, one of the things you mentioned, this is a question for you, is you've got the known knowns here. So I think, that's great. And the pandemic probably qualified as an unknown unknown. And so I'm just kind of curious if in your experience, like that conversation has come up with folks like, well, how do we plan for things because there's crazy things, like stuff like this pandemic could happen. It was crazy. No one expected it. Have you run into that situation with folks kind of, I don't know what the word is, questioning the policy framework, or does it hold pretty firm despite the fact that this is a real curveball?
I think the policy framework has held pretty firm throughout this. I think that I can speak personally that I've just gotten a lot of questions, particularly with respect to the model, as far as how realistic is it, and or how accurate is it? And I'm very upfront and saying, honestly, I have absolutely no idea, and neither does probably any other economist out there. But the point of this whole thing is to provide flexibility, both in terms of how the policies are framed, but as well as the model itself, and say that we can run virtually any scenario you want. So if we're being too optimistic, let's change the assumptions. Let's see what that does to us and how that fits back into our long-term goals. So it's meant to provide, again, that those guiding policies, that grounding force, but also provide both the council and staff with enough flexibility to obviously still run and manage the city and provide the services that we're expected to provide every day, even in the midst of a worldwide pandemic.
Yeah, well, you make a great point, Scott, because the whole point of scenario planning really is to develop a series of strategies that will make you robust against whatever does happen, right? So not to say, well, this is the thing that's going to happen and we're going to be ready for that. It's that we've practiced thinking flexibly and we are therefore prepared to respond to anything that happens, even if it doesn't match, our scenario that we came up with in our model exactly. And if folks are interested in this topic, we did have a webinar 2 weeks ago called Decision Making Under Uncertainty. And we had one yesterday called Financial Scenario Planning. Both of those are on the website that I've been telling you about. You can download all the materials, and you can actually watch a YouTube video of the whole webinar as well. I think the scenario planning video might not be prepared yet because the webinar was just yesterday, but it will be up pretty soon, and so you can watch YouTube videos of both of those webinars, which talk quite a bit about decision making under uncertainty, scenario planning, and gets into the details of how to approach that particular discipline. All right, so with that, we are at the end of our slides. So this is time for questions. So if you have questions, there is a chat feature in your on the WebEx interface, so you feel free to chat us or send us any questions you have over the QA portion. In the meantime, while folks are considering that, just a couple announcements there. We've got the gfwa.org/financial policy challenge, where if you want to submit policies, access templates, download examples, you can do that there. If you would like to access those other resources I've talked about, that is our fiscal first aid website, which is gfwa.org/FFA. So you can go to that website if you're looking to get resources about fiscal first aid, and the challenge website if you're interested in the policies in particular. So let's see. With that, looking at the Q&A portion, I am not seeing any questions at this point. So I think, Scott, we may have done an amazing job in answering every possible question that people have.
I'll just quickly add, if some brilliant realization maybe comes perhaps a few minutes after this webinar concludes, of course, my email is there. You can also find our financial policies and several of our planning documents on our website at kcmo.gov/budget. But if you have questions later on about anything we do or what we've adopted or how we can help, just give me a shout, email, or other.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Scott. And you reminded me, too, that your policies are on the challenge website as well. So if you want KCMO's policies, you'll find those along with everybody else's. That's been part of the challenge on the challenge website. So another way to get Scott's policies. All right, well, good. I am not seeing any questions, so I'm glad that we solved the issue of financial policies today. And with that, I think we are done. So appreciate everybody's time, and we'll stay safe and healthy.